Today I'm swatching all of my Terra Moon's eyeshadows. I did my best to organize these by color, but because they are multi-chromes, I had a little bit of trouble with some of them and categorizing them. So some of them might be a little bit out of place. There will be labels on the screen so you can take screenshots for reference. And some of these I purchased and some of these were sent to me in PR. And I do have an affiliate code, which is Millie15, which I'll put up on the screen. Any shade that is marked with an asterisk means that it is discontinued. Some of them are newly discontinued. They are actually having a sale right now where they are discontinuing over 20 shades. So I did include most of those in here. But since there are 300 eyeshadows, I just couldn't check on all of them. So some of these might be discontinued even if they're not marked as being so. Before we get into the swatches, I'm going to be talking about some different textures that Terra Moon's has with their eyeshadows. They have their own formula, but they do have varying textures and finishes. So for the textural reference, I'm going to be showing you how these pick up on the tip of my finger and then also how they smooth out on the back of my hand. So I have 7 textures, these two being really similar to each other with just a slight variation, but I wanted to show both of them. So these are some of the smoothest shadows that Terra Moon's has. This one is a satin. So you can see it doesn't have a lot of shine. It still has like a decent amount of shine, but compared to some of these other shades, it is definitely more on the satin side. It also feels a little bit thicker to the touch, and the pigment is super smooth, a little less sparkly, while this texture does have just a little bit more kind of sparkle to it, and it is super silky smooth. And then they also have another smoother texture, which is kind of like a hybrid of these two, where it's really smooth, a really fine particle, has a little bit more sparkle to it, just a tiny bit, but it doesn't feel necessarily silky smooth. It has just a little bit of tug to it when you're swatching it out. The next two textures are super foiled metallic. They don't have a lot of these. These are all mostly the neutral shades that they used to have. I think they have discontinued quite a few since then. And then the other texture is super smooth and very kind of piecey. The way it picks up, it just has a little bit more of, it's not that it's flaky, it just has a little bit more sheerness to it. And the way that the pigment is, it's just super fine and it's sparkly. And then the last two textures are really flaky and then kind of like an in-between flaky, which is this one. I did just choose random shades to show in here, but this is the slightly more flaky shade. I feel like it's a little bit more flaky looking in the pan, but it does very much smooth out. And then they have this really flaky kind of shade, really flaky texture, which this one is definitely a bit harder to use, a bit harder to pick up. It gives a little bit more of like a scattered effect. I would say these three tend to be the most sparkliest in texture. And just in case anyone's interested in which shades I swatched, first shade was Castor, then Solar Corona, then Pisces, which is discontinued, then Rubidium, then Halley's Comet, then Calypso, and Butterfly Nebula is the flakiest one. So here's all the textures together. Definitely see a little bit less shine in this one, a bit more sparkle, kind of starting from here, going to here, especially in the more flaky shade, but they do all smooth out. The only thing is the flakier shades tend to need a bit more pressure. They do pick up a little bit unevenly, so I find they're really hard to use with any sort of brush. And I do have a video on best brushes and tools for different textures of shimmers that I will link in the description box. Starting out with the iridescent swatches, I'm not going to be talking about all the different shades and shifts of each shade. We would be here for hours, so I'm just gonna kind of chime in with some different points in between, but this is really just for your reference. So these are mostly green reflecting iridescents, with the last 4 shades being tagged on in this category. I think Little Ghost from the newest palette in here is pretty unique in the way that it shifts from all the way the bright green to blue to purple, and it also seems to have just like a little bit of a base to it compared to some of these other iridescents, even though it looks white in the pan. The flakiest shades here are Rainbow Prism and Airy and Chandrasekhar. Next set of iridescents, these are the blues and the purples or the violet. First Light has a more piecey texture, just slightly larger. It's very similar to Halley's Comet, which is one of my favorite shades from Terra Moon's. Comet Dust is also a little bit flaky, but it's not flaky in a piecey way, so it feels a little bit like a different kind of dry. The particle size just isn't as refined as in First Light, but it's not quite fully flaky. And then Solar, Halo, and Europa are definitely the flakiest, and then Falling Star is much more of a satin, but it is also a discontinued shade. Next up, these are the kind of yellow, orangey, flashing iridescence. Solar Halo is the flakiest, and then the last three shades are definitely much more on the satin side. And then Lightyear, more of an orange reflect with almost a little bit of a really pale plum base and a strong shift, but there's definitely some similarities, especially between Eon, Time Shift, and Saturn Rings. I think they're very similar, Saturn Rings being a little bit lighter, but I definitely don't think you would need all three of those shades. Next up are the pinks and the purples, with Phoenix being a little bit more of an outlier. You can see Astral and Solar Flare are much more on the satin side out of all of these, and also made on Mars. Sublunar is the flakiest, but also the shiniest. It has the most reflect, probably because of the particle size. Pink to blue shifting duochromes. The flakiest are Winter Sun, Quantum Rose, Lunar Cycle, Butterfly Nebula, and Stellar Nursery. And I didn't realize I have actually two of Celestial Petal. I don't know how that happened, but I didn't know until I started labeling the shades that I had two of them. So they're very similar. It's actually interesting because I feel like one of them looks a little bit shinier, but it could be just the way I swatched it. But I feel like especially when you're looking at these at an angle, you can really tell which ones have the largest particle size and are the flakiest. Next up, moving into some more peaches and pinks. Callisto. This is the newer version of Callisto. I believe there is an older version. I definitely recognize that name. I think it is later on in the swatches, and this one has different sparkles throughout it, and it is just a slightly larger particle size. And then the flakiest are Akia, Aphelion, which is not as dry as Akia, and then Saturn Sunset. I do want to point out, I actually have two shades labeled Aphelion. So one of them has the question marks on it. I don't know, I cannot figure out which shade it actually is. So it's a mystery shade, but it is mislabeled as Aphelion. But the correct Aphelion is the third one from the left. Next up, we have some pale rose gold leaning pinks going into super bright fuchsia pinks. The flakiest are Flare Star and WR124 and Messier 20. Gemini and Terrasphere are much more of satin. Mercurian Sunset, Omega Centauri are very similar. And actually one of them is discontinued now, which kind of makes sense. So I feel like there's just very slight difference in the tone of them. I think Omega Centauri is just a little bit more of a dusty pink, but the shift is even very similar. And then Solar Corona has much more of an orange reflect compared to Spiral Galaxy. And also Spiral Galaxy has a very dark forest green shift. Next up, we have some more bright pinks, more magenta, going into kind of almost like a brownish red. The flakiest are Blazing Sky, Crimson Eclipse, GJ504b, Elysium's Eruption, Olympus Mons, Martian Dust, and Europa. And you can really see just how much shinier they are because of that particle size. It just tends to reflect a lot more. And then Cerise Waves is a satin. And then moving on to some more reds, again, leaning a bit pink. None of these I would call necessarily true reds. That being said, Mission to Mars is kind of the closest, but even then, it's not a true red. I do believe I have a comparison of it to Oden Leon somewhere on my channel, and it's definitely not a true red at all. Ruby Satellite maybe has just the tiniest bit of a larger particle size. None of these are overly flaky. Next set of swatches going into some brighter oranges. Proxima and Arcturus are the flakiest, and Sirius is a satin, which it is also discontinued. But there's definitely some really beautiful, smooth but sparkly, almost PC shades like Starcrossed, Axis, for example, and even Antares. Moving on to the yellows, Twilight is definitely the shiniest and most opaque. It does have just a slightly larger particle size, but it does smooth out very nicely. And Daybreak is a satin. I believe this is a very old shade from quite a few years ago, and it has been discontinued. I think Moist Cafe I could have probably put with a bunch of different other shades because it does flash a bit more like a reddish, a bit more red versus yellow or orange. Solstice is a really true bright orange that is a satin. Eris, Perihelion, and Ganymede have a slightly larger particle size. They're a little bit more flaky, but not like the flakiest that Terra Moons has. And the Dorado does glow in the black light. I believe there was one other shade in that collection that launched called Gemini that swatched later on that also glowed in the black light. And Dorado has a small particle size, but it is really loose in the pan for me. Moving into the icy blues, Winter Star is for sure the flakiest out of all of these. The rest of these are pretty smooth, with maybe the exception of Galileo has slightly a little bit different kind of particle size where it has like a smooth base. And it's really interesting. It's almost leaning a little bit more like a grayish blue. And then X-Ray is almost pretty much an iridescent once it's swatched, even though it doesn't necessarily look like that in the pan. It's more blues with some purpley shifts as well as a plum base. Specifically, Moon River definitely has a purpley base to it. So Moon River, Hyperbolide, Comet Tail, Multiverse have a larger particle size. Definitely Moon River would say has the largest, flakiest size. All of these shades are pretty shiny across. Heading into some darker blues and some purples again, we have Adhara, which is a satin, and then Abyss, Pandora, Planet X, Aquarius, Moon have a slightly larger particle size, but nothing overly flaky, but definitely a bit more on the sparkly side. I think some of these I put in here because they do have like a bluish reflect to them, but some of them do have a purple base, such as Pandora and Planet X, and also Ursa Major. And then the last shade on the far left, I wasn't really sure where to categorize because it has blue green flecks throughout it, so I kind of put it in here, but I think I wish I put it into a different category later on. So now we're in the purples. Witch's Broom, Pisces, Arctic Lights, and Ultraviolet are more in the flaky side, and then Otherworld has a blue base with a purple reflex, so it kind of could have gone with the blues and the purples together because of that more blue base. And also Witch's Broom Nebula has like a denim blue base. In this next set, it's more kind of like pink and purple together. So Cosmic Cliffs, Mystic Mountain, and Zenith are the flakiest. I think color-wise, the one that stands out is Celestial Cloudscape, as it does have a dark blue base, but it does have a pinky purple reflect to it. Eagle Nebula, Hyperspace, and Altair are the flakiest from this set. They're very sparkly, and Eagle Nebula and Hyperspace have a very similar base to them, but the shift is different, as well as the reflex straight on Eagle Nebula is more purple. But again, that base is almost like a really kind of washed out grayish denim leaning tone, so it makes it really interesting. I think these could be either more opaque and layered on, or they could be a little bit more sheared out, but you will either way really see the base in those. Moving on to some really common shades. These have a very similar base with varying reflex. While it's a similar base, they have different levels of just how opaque that base is in them, which across the board, for the most part, these are pretty teal in the base, with the exception of Quasar, which has a green base, which I think should have went with the greens actually, but it has a slightly pink reflect to it, so that's why I categorized it in here. Anything that was kind of pinky purple reflecting is in here. So there's just some slight nuances between all these shades. And you can also see the Cosmos, Cosmic Collision, and Stellar Apotheosis and Pistol have a larger particle size. Next up, I'm not sure what to call this category. It's kind of a mix of two different ones. So we have Vampire Star, which is the flakiest, and then Callisto, this is the original Callisto, and this is a satin. It is discontinued. I think Twinkle Dust could have went with the yellows. Vampire Star definitely is very opaque. It has a slightly larger particle size. And Stellar Evolution is very sparkly. I would say probably the sparkliest, while Rosette is much more of a satin. Next up are the greens and teals. Some of these have a mauve base to them, almost like a plum base, specifically Sea of Stars and Interdimensional. Also, Interdimensional does have a flakier particle size, and Supernova is a satin. Next up are the lime greens and aquas. Coalescence, Sunflower Galaxy are flaky, while Castor is very satin, very opaque. I particularly love Radial Velocity and Moon Mist. I feel like they have more of a PC texture to them, and they're just super sparkly, beautiful, refined kind of sparkle. While Galactic Mint, Phases, and Radiation are much more uniformly opaque and have a little bit more of a thicker texture to them. So they're not quite as shiny, but they're not quite a satin. Next up are the kind of grungier greens. A lot of these have a warmer tone brown base, but some lean a little bit more reddish, some lean a little bit more cooler toned. Hourglass, Nebula, Space Case are flaky, as well as Ophiuchus. But the way Space Case is flaky is not necessarily in a dry way like Hourglass Nebula, if that makes sense. The flakiness is a little bit more refined, and it smooths out much easier, and it applies much easier than Hourglass Nebula. This definitely includes some very common shades, but also some very unique shades, which I think are Hubble, M33, and Beyond Apollo. I feel like those are kind of really grungy kind of shades. Except for the really grungier shades that I always have a hard time describing. Some of these have a little bit of a teal or like a dark green base, which makes them really grungy, but they have a very contrasting reflect to it that's almost leaning really cool tone pink, almost like a dusty pink or dusty purple. These are all mostly satin shades, with Super Luminous having the largest particle size out of all of these shades. Next up are some more grungy shades. Solar Expansion, Photostar, and Milky Way are the flakiest out of the bunch. Definitely some very similar tones, especially in the last 6 shades there. They're almost a little bit more icy, leaning a little bit more like a gray with a little bit more pizzazz, but they do have a little bit of the pink reflect, specifically Milky Way and Atomic Division. Next up, we're heading into some neutrals. Now, these neutrals are less shiny than the next set of neutrals. That being said, Moonwater and Moonkissed are very beautifully, uniformly metallic, so they're definitely the shiniest out of this bunch. A few of these shades did launch as highlighters. Within this set and the textures and finishes in here, I think Moonkiss is pretty different because it is very white, but it has slightly larger particle size on top of the base of it, which makes it very sparkly, and they're pretty even throughout, but you can definitely see them, especially up close, how twinkly they are. These next set of neutrals are the shiniest neutrals. They're so beautiful, very punchy, and they do vary a little bit in flakiness, with Carbon being the most flaky shade out of all, while Nebula Whisper is a little bit more similar in texture to the original Adept Minka shades, where it has just a tiny bit of grittiness, also similarly to the, I believe it was the Moonscapes collection from Devinah, their original kind of neutrals before they launched their most recent more smoother neutrals, but these are so beautiful. Some of these have a little bit more variation in tone than others. So for example, between Autumn Sunset, Rubidium, and Aurora's Rays, I feel like you could really just get one and be all set. I do want to call out 13 Zodiac was also really flaky, and it is a manufacturer shadow from their newest palette. And it was also squishy, so definitely a different formula for Terra Moons. That being said, pigment wise and the way that it looks in the texture, once it's actually used and applied, it is similar. Some of the handmade single eyeshadow textures from Terra Moons. And then the last set is kind of slightly still some neutrals, but they have a little bit more of a spice to them. Universal Light is extra sparkly and has a slightly larger particle size. And then Haze of the Moon is a highlighter. I love the shade. It is a beautiful eyeshadow. It's very, very dimensional. Definitely a standout shade for me. I love the shade Atmosphere. I feel like it has a really interesting plummy taupiness to it. Really beautiful kind of neutral. And I also love Solari, one of my favorites from Terra Moons. It is such a stunning dimensional neutral, more like duochrome leaning shade, but even so, maybe not a full duochrome, but it just has that dimensionality because of the way shiny and the way that it reflects the light, where sometimes it looks a little bit darker and sometimes it looks a little bit lighter. And those are over 300 Terra Moons eyeshadows. I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, then definitely don't forget to give it a thumbs up and let me know which brand I should swatch all of my eyeshadows from next. And if you like this kind of content as well as tutorials, then check out some of my other videos I will put up on the screen. And thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time.